Go back to your scrapyard if you want to eat with people like you. The laughter came first. Loud, sharp, public. And for a moment, every conversation inside the harbor ballroom seemed to stop. The man who had spoken those words stood near the center of the room beneath crystal lights and polished steel beams overlooking Lake Michigan. Richard Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Maritime Systems, smiled as though he had delivered the perfect joke. Around him, investors, executives, and local politicians exchanged uneasy laughs. Some found it amusing. Others simply did not want to disagree with the most powerful man in the room. Standing 15 feet away, Jack Turner said nothing. He simply held the delivery clipboard in one hand and looked toward the harbor windows beyond the crowd. Outside, cargo cranes stretched against the evening sky. Harbor lights reflected across dark water. The smell of salt, diesel, and steel drifted through the open service entrance nearby. It reminded him of places he had known long ago, places he rarely allowed himself to remember. "Dad?" a quiet voice asked beside him. Jack looked down. His 12-year-old daughter, Emily, stood near his shoulder. Her expression carried confusion more than anger. She did not fully understand why people were laughing. She only knew they were laughing at her father. Jack forced a small smile. "It is all right." But Emily could see the truth. Children often could. Jack Turner spent his days operating Turner Salvage and Recycling, a modest scrap yard on the south side of Chicago. It was not glamorous work. Most people never noticed the men who hauled discarded metal away from factories, shipyards, and construction sites. Yet the business paid bills. It kept food on the table. It allowed a single father to raise the only person who mattered in his world. That evening, his company had been contracted to remove several tons of industrial scrap left behind after renovations at the Harbor Convention Center. The job was routine. Deliver paperwork. Verify pickup schedules. Leave quietly. Instead, somehow, he had become entertainment. Richard Caldwell adjusted his expensive cufflinks and glanced toward Jack again. "You look lost." More scattered laughter followed. "The service entrance is around the corner." Several guests smiled awkwardly. A few lowered their eyes. One elderly man appeared uncomfortable enough to leave his table altogether. Yet nobody challenged the CEO. Power often created silence. Jack understood that better than most. He placed the clipboard under one arm. "We are only here to finish the paperwork." Richard shrugged dramatically. "Exactly my point." The room laughed again. Emily's face tightened. Jack noticed immediately. The words themselves did not bother him. He had been underestimated before. Many times. What bothered him was seeing his daughter forced to witness it. The harbor ballroom glowed with wealth. Waiters moved between tables carrying polished trays. Live music drifted softly through the room. Expensive suits filled every corner. And standing among them, Jack looked exactly like what he was. A hard-working man in worn work boots and a simple jacket. Yet something about him felt different from the others. Calm, grounded, unmoved. The kind of stillness that comes only after surviving storms most people never see. Emily slipped her hand into his. Jack squeezed it gently. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let us finish what we came to do." He turned toward the service corridor. But as he began walking away from the laughter, something unexpected caught his attention. Hanging on the far wall near the ballroom entrance was a large framed photograph of a naval fleet crossing open water beneath a stormy sky. For the briefest moment, Jack stopped. His eyes remained fixed on the image. Not because of the ships, not because of the ocean, but because buried somewhere inside that photograph was a memory he had spent years trying to leave behind. Then, just as quickly, he looked away and continued walking. Yet from across the room, an older man seated alone near the windows had noticed the pause. And the moment he saw Jack's face, his expression changed completely. The older man continued watching long after Jack disappeared into the service corridor. Unlike most of the guests, he had not laughed. In fact, the moment Jack paused in front of the naval photograph, something had shifted behind the man's eyes. Recognition. Not certainty. Not yet. But enough to make him pay attention. Meanwhile, Jack and Emily moved through the quieter sections of the convention center. The sounds of the ballroom faded behind them. Here, the atmosphere felt different. Less polished. More honest. Forklifts moved slowly through loading areas. Workers checked inventories. Metal containers sat stacked beside warehouse walls. It was a world Jack understood. Emily remained silent for several moments. Finally, she spoke. Why did he say that? Jack kept walking. People say things. But why? Her voice carried more hurt than anger. We did not do anything wrong. Jack looked at his daughter and felt a familiar ache in his chest. Every parent wants to protect their child from disappointment. Every parent eventually discovers they cannot protect them from all of it. No, he said softly. We did not. Emily lowered her eyes. Then why were they laughing? Jack stopped beside an open loading bay overlooking the harbor. Evening wind drifted inside, carrying the scent of water and rusted steel. Cargo ships sat anchored in the distance beneath fading sunlight. For a moment, he simply watched the waves. Sometimes people decide who someone is before they know anything about them. Emily frowned. That is not fair. A small smile touched Jack's face. No, it is not. The answer seemed to satisfy her only slightly. They resumed walking toward the administrative office where the final paperwork awaited. Along the way, several dock workers greeted Jack by name. One thanked him for helping locate replacement equipment last month. Another waved enthusiastically from a forklift. Each interaction seemed natural, genuine, respectful. Emily noticed. Everyone here likes you. Jack laughed quietly. That is because they know me. The statement lingered in the air between them. Back inside the ballroom, Richard Caldwell accepted congratulations from several guests who found his confidence entertaining. He stood surrounded by wealth, influence, and admiration. Yet the older man near the windows continued watching the service corridor instead. Finally, another guest approached him. Everything all right, Walter? The older man nodded slowly. Maybe. You seem distracted. Walter glanced toward the naval photograph hanging on the far wall. I am trying to remember something. The guest followed his gaze. A memory? Walter's expression tightened. A name. Elsewhere in the harbor complex, Jack completed the required documents and prepared to leave. The work had taken less than 20 minutes. Another ordinary job. Another evening finished. Yet as he signed the final page, the office manager looked up from her desk. You know, they are expecting some important military guests tonight. Jack paused briefly. So I heard. Big event. Lots of publicity. She smiled. You should stick around and see the ceremony. Jack shook his head. That is not really my world anymore. The words escaped before he could stop them. The manager looked confused. Jack simply handed over the paperwork and changed the subject. A few minutes later, he and Emily headed back toward the parking lot. They passed the harbor shoreline where lights were beginning to illuminate the docks. The water reflected streaks of gold and blue beneath the darkening sky. Emily suddenly stopped walking. Dad. Jack turned. What is it? She pointed toward the convention center entrance. A line of black vehicles had begun arriving one after another. Security personnel moved into position. Guests gathered near the entrance. Excitement spread through the crowd. Even from a distance, something significant was clearly happening. Jack glanced toward the activity for only a second before looking away. But unknown to him, inside the ballroom, Walter had finally remembered the name that had been bothering him. And the moment he did, the color drained from his face. Walter Dawson spent the next several minutes pretending to listen to conversations he no longer heard. Around him, the ballroom buzzed with excitement as more guests gathered near the entrance. Important people were arriving. Cameras were being positioned. Staff members moved quickly between tables. Yet Walter's attention remained fixed on a single thought. Jack Turner. The name echoed through memories he had not revisited in years. Across the harbor, Jack and Emily reached the parking area beside the scrap truck. The old vehicle sat beneath yellow dock lights, surrounded by shipping containers and stacks of reclaimed metal waiting for transport. To most people it looked ordinary. To Jack, it represented survival. Every dent told a story. Every mile had paid for groceries, school supplies, rent, and countless sacrifices made quietly over the years. Emily climbed into the passenger seat, but noticed her father had not started the engine. He sat staring through the windshield toward the water. You are thinking about something. Jack smiled faintly. You always know. Because you get that look. He laughed softly. What look? The one where you were somewhere else. Emily's observation landed closer to the truth than she realized. Jack's eyes drifted toward the distant harbor lights. Long ago, another shoreline had looked very similar. Different ocean, different mission, different life. A cold wind swept across the dock, pulling him briefly back to the present. Dad, Emily asked, were you ever in the Navy? The question struck like an unexpected wave. Jack looked at her carefully. Why would you ask that? Emily shrugged. The picture inside the ballroom. The ships. You looked at it differently. For several seconds, Jack said nothing. Then he looked out the windshield again. A long time ago, I worked around a lot of ships. It was not exactly an answer. Emily knew it. But she also knew when not to push. Back inside the convention center, Walter finally stood from his chair. The more he thought about the face, the posture, the eyes, the more certain he became. Yet certainty created a new problem. If he was right, then the man Richard Caldwell had mocked in front of everyone was not who they believed him to be. Walter moved through the crowd until he reached an old acquaintance. Do you know the scrapyard owner who was here earlier? The man laughed. The guy Caldwell embarrassed? Walter ignored the comment. Do you know his full name? Jack Turner, I think. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Confirmation. The name fit. The face fit. The timeline fit. When he opened his eyes again, concern had replaced curiosity. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell continued entertaining guests near the ballroom stage. Confidence radiated from him. He spoke about contracts, investments, and future expansions. People listened because powerful people are rarely questioned. Yet even as he talked, whispers began moving through the room. Small at first, barely noticeable. Walter had quietly spoken to two people. Those two spoke to others. A single question spread from table to table. Who exactly is Jack Turner? No one had an answer. That only made the question stronger. Outside, Jack finally started the truck. The engine rumbled to life. He prepared to pull away when flashing lights appeared near the convention center entrance. Not emergency vehicles. Official vehicles. Black SUVs lined the curb while security personnel moved into position. Emily looked through the passenger window. That must be important. Jack nodded. Probably. Yet despite himself, he watched for another moment. Something about the arrival stirred an old instinct. A feeling he had spent years teaching himself to ignore. Discipline. Awareness. Readiness. The kind of habits that never fully disappear. Then he shook the thought away and placed the truck into gear. The life he lived now was different. Simpler. Quieter. As the truck rolled toward the exit, neither Jack nor Emily noticed Walter emerging from the convention center doors, searching the parking area. By the time he reached the sidewalk, the scrap truck was already disappearing into the night. Walter watched the taillights fade into the distance. Then he looked back toward the ballroom where hundreds of guests celebrated beneath chandeliers. His expression grew increasingly troubled. Because if tomorrow unfolded the way he suspected it might, someone very important was about to walk into that room. And when they did, Richard Caldwell would wish he had never spoken a single word. The drive home was quiet. Chicago's lights slid across the windshield while the scrap truck moved steadily through familiar streets. Emily eventually fell asleep against the passenger window. Jack glanced toward her occasionally and smiled. Children carried burdens differently than adults. They hurt deeply, then somehow found a way to sleep. By the time they reached their small house, the city had settled into darkness. Jack carried Emily's backpack inside while she rubbed sleep from her eyes and headed toward her room. The house was modest. 2 bedrooms. Old wooden floors. Furniture collected over years rather than purchased all at once. Nothing impressive. Yet every corner carried memories. Every wall represented a promise Jack had made long ago and refused to break. After Emily disappeared down the hallway, Jack remained alone in the kitchen. The silence felt heavier than usual. He opened the refrigerator, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window overlooking the backyard. Beyond the fence sat stacks of salvaged metal waiting to be sorted the next morning. Ordinary work. Honest work. The kind of work many people looked down on until they needed it done. Eventually his eyes drifted toward a cabinet above the refrigerator. For several seconds he simply stared at it. Then, almost reluctantly, he reached up and opened the door. Hidden behind old paperwork sat a weathered wooden box. Dust covered the corners. The brass latch showed signs of age. Jack carefully carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. For a moment, he only looked at it. Memories often arrive quietly. Not with noise. Not with drama. Just a feeling that settles somewhere deep inside the chest. Slowly, he opened the lid. Inside rested a collection of items he had not touched in years. A folded flag. Several photographs. Military challenge coins. A faded patch from a naval unit. And beneath them all, a medal tucked inside a velvet case. Jack stared at the contents without moving. The harbor photograph from the ballroom returned to his thoughts. So did the ocean, the ships, the faces of men he had once known. Some memories carried pride, others carried loss. All of them belonged to a life he rarely discussed. A floorboard creaked behind him. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway wearing pajamas. I knew you were looking at it. Jack smiled weakly. I thought you were asleep. I was trying. She walked closer. Unlike most children, Emily had seen the box before. Not often, just enough to know it mattered. Are those from the Navy? She asked quietly. Jack hesitated, then nodded. Some of them. Emily pulled out a chair beside him. You never talk about it. Jack looked down at the photographs. Most showed groups of young men standing beside ships or aircraft, smiling, confident, certain the future would last forever. Some things happened a long time ago. Emily studied him carefully. Bad things. Jack considered the question. Not all of them. The answer seemed honest enough. Emily pointed toward one photograph. A much younger Jack stood beside several uniformed sailors. Who are they? For the first time that evening, genuine warmth entered his expression. Friends. Emily smiled. You look different. Jack laughed softly. I was younger. You look happier. The observation caught him off guard. He looked at the photograph again. Maybe she was right. Maybe she was not. Life changes people. Responsibility changes people. Loss changes people. Before he could answer, his phone suddenly vibrated on the table. The sound startled both of them. Jack glanced at the screen. An unknown number. No name. No identification. Normally, he would have ignored it. Instead, something compelled him to answer. Hello. Silence greeted him at first. Then a voice. Older. Careful. Respectful. Jack Turner. Jack's expression changed instantly. Because although years had passed, he recognized the voice immediately. And the man speaking should not have had any reason to call him after all this time. Jack remained completely still as the voice echoed through the phone. Years had passed since he had last heard it, but some voices never truly leave you. They become attached to memories too important to fade. Emily watched him carefully from across the kitchen table. She immediately sensed the change in his expression. Jack Turner? The voice repeated. It has been a long time. Jack leaned back slowly in his chair. Walter Dawson. Across the line came a brief laugh. I was wondering if you would remember. Jack glanced toward the open wooden box, toward the photographs, toward a chapter of life he had spent years trying to place behind him. I remember. Silence settled between them for a moment. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind shared by people connected through experiences that require no explanation. Finally, Walter spoke again. I saw you tonight. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. At the harbor? Yes. Walter hesitated. I saw what happened. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. Emily quietly lowered her eyes. Even she knew exactly what Walter meant. Jack sighed. It was nothing. No. Walter's voice became firmer. It was not nothing. Jack did not respond. He had spent years learning how to absorb insults without allowing them to define him. The mockery from Richard Caldwell already belonged in the past, as far as he was concerned. Yet Walter clearly saw it differently. That man had no idea who he was talking to. Jack rubbed his forehead. Walter, I mean it. Let it go. Another pause followed. This time longer. He could almost hear Walter considering his next words. You always did that. Jack smiled despite himself. Did what? Take the hit and move on. Emily looked between the phone and her father, confused but fascinated. She had never heard anyone speak to him this way. Not with admiration. Not with familiarity. Walter continued. There are people who still remember Jack. Jack looked toward the dark kitchen window. His reflection stared back. Older. Tired. Different. That was another life. Maybe. Walter's voice softened. But it happened. The words lingered heavily in the room. After a few moments, Walter changed the subject. He asked about Emily. About the scrapyard. About life after service. The conversation drifted through old memories and ordinary updates. Yet beneath everything sat an unspoken tension. Walter had not called simply to reconnect. Both men knew it. Eventually the topic returned. There is something else. Jack closed his eyes briefly. Here it comes. What is it? The harbor event continues tomorrow. Jack frowned. And a special guest is arriving. Jack immediately understood why Walter's tone had changed. That does not concern me. It might. Walter, hear me out. The older man's voice carried unusual urgency now. Some people are asking questions. Jack's jaw tightened. About what? Walter exhaled slowly. About you. The answer landed harder than expected. Across the table, Emily's eyes widened. Jack looked away. That is exactly what I do not want. I know. Then stop asking them. Walter laughed softly. I am not the one asking. The room fell silent again. Outside, wind rattled tree branches against the fence. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. The kind Jack had worked hard to build. He had no desire to revisit old chapters. No desire for attention. No desire for recognition. Yet something in Walter's voice suggested events had already begun moving beyond either man's control. Finally, Walter spoke one last time. Just be careful tomorrow. Jack frowned. Careful of what? But Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he chose his words with surprising caution. Sometimes the past stays quiet because it chooses to, not because it disappears. Before Jack could press further, the call ended with a promise to speak again soon. The kitchen returned to silence. Emily stared at her father. Who was that? Jack looked down at the photographs still spread across the table. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. An old friend. Yet even as he said it, he knew the call had changed something. Because far across the city, inside a luxury hotel overlooking the lake, another phone was ringing. And the person answering it carried a rank that could make entire rooms stand at attention. The next morning arrived with gray skies hanging low over Chicago. A cold breeze swept through Turner Salvage and Recycling as workers unloaded trucks and sorted metal across the yard. Sparks flashed from cutting equipment. Forklifts moved between stacks of steel. The familiar rhythm of hard work filled the air. Jack preferred mornings like this. Simple, predictable, honest. The kind of days that left little room for old memories. Yet despite his efforts, Walter's phone call remained in the back of his mind. Every few hours, he found himself replaying the conversation. Not because of what Walter had said, because of what he had not said. Emily sat in a small office near the front gate finishing school assignments before classes began later that afternoon. She occasionally glanced through the window toward her father. Even from a distance, she could tell something was different. Jack was working, smiling, talking with employees. But a quiet tension followed him throughout the morning. Around 11 o'clock, a dark sedan rolled into the scrap yard. It immediately looked out of place among the machinery and shipping containers. Employees noticed it too. Expensive cars rarely visited Turner Salvage unless someone had gotten lost. The vehicle stopped near the office. A sharply dressed man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. His polished shoes seemed completely unsuited for the gravel-covered yard. Jack approached him cautiously. Can I help you? The man extended a business card. Mr. Turner? Jack accepted the card. It belonged to Caldwell Maritime Systems. Richard Caldwell's company. Jack felt a brief flicker of surprise. That depends. The visitor offered a professional smile. Mr. Caldwell would like to invite you back to the harbor event this evening. Jack stared at him. Why? The man adjusted his tie. There will be a reception before tonight's ceremony. Several community business owners are being recognized. Jack almost laughed. 24 hours earlier, he had been publicly humiliated in that same building. Now he was receiving an invitation. Something about it felt wrong. I think there has been a mistake. No mistake. The man handed him an envelope. Your name is on the list. Jack accepted it, but made no effort to open it. The visitor nodded politely and returned to his sedan. Within moments, the vehicle disappeared back onto the road. Emily emerged from the office almost immediately. Who was that? Jack held up the envelope. Someone from the harbor. What did they want? Jack looked down at the invitation. Apparently, they want us to come back tonight. Emily's eyebrows lifted. After what happened? Exactly. She crossed her arms. You are not going, are you? Jack did not answer right away. The truth was he had no intention of returning. Pride had nothing to do with it. He simply preferred avoiding unnecessary attention. Yet throughout the afternoon, more strange things happened. First came another phone call, then an email, then a message from an event coordinator confirming his attendance. By 3 o'clock, it felt as though people were making plans involving him without his permission. Even stranger, no one seemed willing to explain why. Meanwhile, across the city, preparations for the evening ceremony intensified. Security teams coordinated arrivals. Media crews assembled equipment. Guests confirmed seating arrangements. Excitement spread throughout the harbor district because one particular visitor was expected before sunset. Richard Caldwell stood near the ballroom stage reviewing final details. Confidence had returned to him completely. Whatever whispers had circulated the previous night no longer concerned him. Business was thriving. Important guests were arriving. Everything appeared under control. Yet nearby, Walter Dawson watched the activity with growing unease. He had spent the entire day making calls of his own. Every conversation led to the same conclusion. Events were moving forward now. Too many people knew pieces of the story. Too many questions had already been asked. And somewhere beyond the city skyline, a military aircraft had just landed. As passengers exited onto the runway, one distinguished officer paused beside the aircraft stairs and accepted a briefing folder. He opened it, studied the first page, and stopped walking. His eyes settled on a familiar name. Then, very slowly, he smiled. By late afternoon, the invitation still sat unopened on Jack's kitchen counter. He had returned home from the scrap yard hoping distance would simplify the decision. Instead, the hours only made it more complicated. Emily sat at the table doing homework while stealing occasional glances toward the envelope. Neither of them mentioned it for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, she set down her pencil. "You were thinking about going." Jack looked up from a stack of invoices. "Maybe." Emily tilted her head. "Yesterday you said you were not." "Yesterday was different." She nodded slowly. "Because people keep calling?" Jack smiled faintly. "Something like that." The truth was harder to explain. It was not curiosity pulling him back toward the harbor. It was the feeling that pieces of a puzzle were moving around him without his participation. The calls, the invitation, Walter's warning. None of it made sense. Yet ignoring it no longer felt possible. As evening approached, the city began shifting toward the event. Downtown traffic thickened. News stations mentioned the arrival of distinguished military leadership attending a maritime innovation ceremony. Social media buzzed with photos of luxury vehicles and waterfront decorations. At the Harbor Convention Center, excitement reached a level Richard Caldwell thoroughly enjoyed. Guests filled the ballroom once again. Crystal lights reflected across polished floors. Waiters moved through crowds carrying trays of drinks and appetizers. Cameras waited near the entrance. Richard stood near the stage shaking hands and accepting praise. He appeared completely comfortable, completely confident. Whatever concerns had existed the previous night seemed forgotten. Yet not everyone shared his confidence. Walter Dawson remained near the back of the room. Every few minutes he checked his watch. Then the entrance. Then his watch again. He was waiting for someone. And judging by the tension in his face, the wait felt longer than it should. Across town, Jack finally opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation addressed specifically to him and Emily. Their names had been printed individually, not added later, not scribbled by hand. Whoever prepared it had expected them to attend. Emily read over his shoulder. "They even put my name." Jack nodded slowly. "I noticed." For several moments, neither spoke. Then Emily surprised him. "Maybe we should go." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Yesterday you wanted nothing to do with that place." "I know." She looked down briefly. "But I do not want them deciding who we are." The words caught him off guard. Not because they were dramatic. Because they sounded exactly like something he once believed himself. Quiet dignity often reveals itself in unexpected ways. Jack studied his daughter for a long moment. Then he stood and picked up the invitation. Less than an hour later, they were driving back toward the harbor. The same building, the same lights reflecting across dark water. Yet everything felt different. Neither spoke much during the drive. Anticipation filled the silence. Somewhere between uncertainty and instinct, Jack had made his choice. Inside the ballroom, an announcement suddenly echoed through the speakers. Guests turned toward the entrance. Conversations softened. Security personnel straightened their posture. The long-awaited arrival was approaching. Richard Caldwell immediately moved toward the front of the room. Cameras followed. Important people gathered behind him. Everyone wanted to be seen in the right place when the distinguished guest entered. Outside, black vehicles rolled to a stop beneath the convention center lights. Doors opened. Uniformed officers stepped out first, then senior officials, then several aides. The atmosphere changed instantly. Respect carries a different kind of weight than wealth. Even before anyone spoke, the room could feel it approaching. Meanwhile, Jack and Emily entered through a side corridor and paused near the back of the ballroom. Most guests remained focused on the entrance and failed to notice them. Walter did notice. The moment he saw Jack, relief crossed his face. But before he could reach him, movement at the front of the room drew every eye forward. The distinguished officer had just entered. The crowd erupted into applause. Richard Caldwell stepped forward with a practiced smile and extended his hand. The officer shook it politely. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Yet almost immediately, something unexpected happened. The officer's attention drifted past Richard, past the executives, past the investors. His eyes searched the room as though looking for someone specific. And then suddenly, they stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the distinguished officer standing near the ballroom entrance. Richard Caldwell still wore the confident smile expected in moments like this, but something had changed. The officer was no longer looking at him. He was looking beyond him, past the cameras, past the executives, past the carefully arranged reception line, toward the back of the room, toward Jack Turner. A strange silence spread through the crowd. Not complete silence, more like the sound of anticipation. People sensed something important was happening even if they did not yet understand what. Richard noticed it too. He followed the officer's gaze and immediately spotted Jack standing beside Emily near the rear wall. Confusion flashed across his face. Why would someone of that rank be looking at a scrapyard owner? Nearby, Walter Dawson slowly exhaled. The moment he had feared and expected at the same time was finally arriving. Yet even now, he could not predict exactly how events would unfold. Jack stood perfectly still. Years of experience had taught him how to remain calm when everyone else became distracted by noise. Still, he felt Emily tighten her grip on his hand. "Dad," she whispered, "why is he looking at us?" Jack did not answer, because he did not know, or perhaps because part of him already suspected. The officer exchanged a few quiet words with an aide. The aide nodded immediately and stepped aside. Then the officer looked toward the stage organizers, who appeared increasingly uncertain. Richard moved forward again, eager to regain control of the moment. "Admiral, if you would like, we can begin the presentation." The officer smiled politely. In a moment, the answer sounded harmless, yet it carried enough authority to end the discussion immediately. Richard stepped back. Cameras continued recording. Reporters whispered among themselves. Questions spread through the room. At the back of the ballroom, Emily glanced up at her father. "Do you know him?" Jack looked toward the harbor windows where darkness had settled across the water. "A long time ago, I knew a lot of people." It was not really an answer. Emily knew that, but she could hear something unusual in his voice. Not fear, not excitement, something closer to reluctance. The kind of reluctance that comes from seeing a door reopen after years of keeping it closed. Across the room, the officer finally began walking. Not toward the stage, not toward the executives waiting beside Richard Caldwell. He moved slowly through the crowd instead. Guests instinctively stepped aside. Conversations faded. Every movement seemed to increase the tension. Richard watched with growing discomfort. His smile had vanished completely now. Something about this situation felt increasingly beyond his control. Several people who had witnessed the humiliation the previous evening exchanged nervous looks. Walter remained motionless. The closer the officer came to Jack, the more memories surfaced in his own mind. Ships cutting through rough seas. Young men carrying responsibilities larger than themselves. Decisions made under pressure. Names that were never forgotten. Jack felt those memories too. He had spent years building a different life. A quieter life. One focused on Emily, the scrapyard, and the future instead of the past. Yet suddenly the distance between those two worlds seemed to be disappearing. The officer stopped halfway across the ballroom. For several seconds he simply stood there studying Jack. The expression on his face was impossible to read. Respect, recognition, gratitude, perhaps all three. Emily looked around and realized everyone in the room was watching her father. Every executive, every guest, every camera. The attention made her nervous. But it also stirred something else. Pride. Because for the first time since entering the building, she was no longer seeing people look down at him. They were looking at him differently. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered insults. Nobody pointed toward the service entrance. The room had changed. Yet the biggest revelation had not arrived. Not yet. The officer took another step forward. Then another. The distance between them continued shrinking. And as he approached, Richard Caldwell finally noticed something that sent a chill through him. The expression on the Admiral's face was not the expression of someone meeting a stranger. It was the expression of someone approaching a man he already knew by name. The Admiral continued walking until he stood directly in front of Jack Turner. The ballroom had become so quiet that even the distant sound of waves against the harbor docks seemed louder than before. Hundreds of guests watched without speaking. Cameras remained frozen in place. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. For a long moment, neither man said a word. Then the Admiral smiled. Not the polite smile reserved for ceremonies or photographs. A genuine smile. The kind that comes from seeing someone who mattered. "Jack Turner," he said. "It has been far too long." The silence deepened. Richard Caldwell felt the blood drain from his face. The Admiral knew his name. Not only knew it, spoke it with warmth and respect. Jack stood calmly, his hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder. "Good to see you too, Admiral." Around the room, confusion spread rapidly. Executives exchanged looks. Reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The Admiral turned slightly toward Emily. "And this must be your daughter." Emily nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." The Admiral smiled again. "Your father is one of the finest men I have ever known." Emily's eyes widened. She looked up at Jack. Her father lowered his gaze, almost embarrassed by the attention. The Admiral noticed. He always had. Some people chase recognition. Others spend their lives avoiding it. Jack had always belonged to the second group. Richard finally stepped forward. "Admiral, I did not realize you were acquainted." The Admiral slowly turned toward him. His expression remained professional, but the warmth was gone. "Acquainted." He glanced back toward Jack. "That is not the word I would use." The room waited. The Admiral continued. "There are moments in life when leadership is measured by titles. And there are moments when it is measured by character. Years ago, I witnessed Mr. Turner choose duty, loyalty, and courage when nobody was watching. He never asked for recognition. He never spoke about it afterward. In fact, he spent years making sure most people never knew." The guests listened in complete silence. No classified stories were shared. No dramatic details were revealed. The Admiral respected those boundaries. Yet he said enough. Enough for everyone to understand that the quiet man standing near the back wall was not who they had assumed. "Some people build companies," the Admiral said. "Some people build reputations. Jack Turner built lives, and then returned home without asking for applause." Nobody laughed now. Nobody looked toward the service entrance. Nobody saw a scrapyard owner. They saw a man whose dignity had never depended on the opinions of strangers. Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time all evening, he seemed unsure of what to say. Jack rescued him from the moment the same way he had spent years rescuing others from discomfort. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. The Admiral nodded. "Maybe." Then he looked at Emily. But character does not expire. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not from sadness, from understanding. All those years she had watched her father leave before sunrise, work until exhaustion, and come home carrying the weight of responsibilities few people noticed. Never complaining, never demanding praise. Now she finally saw what others saw. Not because of medals, not because of rank, because of who he was. The applause began with one person, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Not because they had been instructed to, because respect had finally found its rightful place. Jack looked uncomfortable as the applause continued. Yet beside him, Emily stood a little taller. The harbor lights shimmered beyond the ballroom windows. The water reflected gold and silver across the night. And for the first time since entering that building, peace settled across Jack's face. He had never needed recognition to know his worth. But seeing his daughter understand it meant everything. Sometimes the loudest victory is not a speech, not revenge, not humiliation returned. Sometimes it is a room full of people discovering they were wrong, and a good man remaining kind anyway. If this story touched you, share where you are watching from and tell us what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe dignity speaks louder than pride, consider subscribing for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of respect that cannot be bought.